Victor Dane came off the emergency bed too fast for a man who'd just taken a bullet to the arm. He snatched a metal fragment from the instrument tray and pressed it against Nurse Elena Foster's throat before anyone in the room had time to process what was happening. The doctor froze. The security guard stepped back. Nobody moved. Terrence Brooks was standing in the corner, a diagnostic tablet in one hand and a replacement fuse in the other. He had come to fix the cardiac monitor. That was all he had come to do. He set the tablet down on the counter. Quietly, he walked to the hallway door and locked it. He unbuckled his belt, folded it once, and placed it on the nearest surface. Then he stepped into Victor's line of sight and spoke in a voice so flat it barely registered as a threat. "Let her go." When Victor lunged, Terrence put him on the floor in under 8 seconds. No wasted movement, no second strike. He turned to Elena and asked if she was hurt. The camera in the corner recorded everything. If this story already has your attention, go ahead and subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Terrence Brooks and his daughter Maya lived in a 2-bedroom apartment 14 minutes on foot from St. Catherine's Medical Center. It was a deliberate choice close enough that he could get home fast if something went wrong at school, far enough that the hospital felt like a separate world when he walked through the front door each evening. His mornings ran on a fixed routine. He was up at 5:15, coffee brewed by 5:30, Maya's lunch packed and sitting on the counter before she came downstairs. He drove her to school at 7:40, clocked in at 8, and spent the next 9 hours doing the work that kept St. Catherine's running without anyone noticing it was being done, replacing worn seals on ventilator pressure valves, recalibrating infusion pump sensors, tracing electrical faults in monitoring units that the technical staff had given up on and labeled for replacement. He was good at finding the problem inside the machine. He always had been. Evenings were Maya's. He picked her up, made dinner, sat across the table from her while she walked him through whatever was happening in the 4th grade with the patience of someone who considered every word she said worth listening to. He checked her homework. He read with her when she wanted company and left her alone when she didn't. On Saturdays, they went to the library. On Sundays, he prepped for the week ahead. His life had been designed very deliberately to contain nothing unexpected. Nobody at St. Catherine's knew that Terrence had spent 9 years in a naval special warfare unit that did not appear on any organizational chart available to the public. Nobody knew about the missions in places that didn't officially exist, or the 4 languages he could navigate well enough to run an extraction under fire, or the particular skill set that had made him valuable to people who dealt in outcomes rather than processes. Nobody knew about Marcus Webb. Marcus had been his closest friend since their 2nd year of training, the kind of friendship that forms between people who have stood in the same darkness and chosen to keep moving. They had run 17 missions together. They had pulled each other out of situations that should not have had survivors. The 18th mission had gone wrong before their boots touched the ground. Their position had been sold, not lost, not leaked through sloppy communication, sold deliberately by someone with access and motive. The ambush was waiting for them. Marcus took 2 rounds in the first 40 seconds. Terrence got him behind cover and kept pressure on the wounds for 11 minutes while running a 1-man perimeter, and it still wasn't enough. He had left the military 8 months later, filed the paperwork, packed his gear, and flown home to a daughter who was 18 months old and living with his mother because he had not been present enough to be called a father in any meaningful sense. He had spent the next 3 years learning how to be one. The medals were in a locked box in the back of his closet behind a stack of winter blankets Maya had never touched. He didn't look at them. He didn't talk about them. When people at the hospital asked where he'd served, they could always tell something in the posture, the economy of movement. He said he'd done a few years in the Navy and left it at that. It was true enough. Elena Foster had been at St. Catherine's for 6 years, long enough to know which residents were going to burn out by spring and which attending physicians would lie on an incident report to protect their numbers. She had a reputation for being difficult, which in the emergency department meant she was the nurse who actually read the protocol before deciding whether to follow it and who said so clearly when she disagreed with a course of treatment. She had noticed Terrence the way she noticed most things in the department, not all at once, but gradually through accumulated detail. He always chose the seat with the clearest sight line to the cafeteria door. When a supply cart tipped over at the end of the hall one morning and sent a rack of metal trays crashing to the floor, every head in the room turned toward the sound. Terrence turned toward the exit first, just for a half second, then back, shoulders dropping, jaw releasing some internal assessment, completing itself faster than thought. Nothing here. Stand down. She'd seen that before. Not often, but she'd seen it. She asked him about it once, indirectly. She said she'd noticed he always seemed to know where the exits were. He told her it was an old habit and changed the subject with the practiced ease of someone who had been changing that subject for years. She didn't push, but she filed it away. One afternoon, about 3 weeks before any of this happened, Elena had been eating lunch alone in the cafeteria when Terrence sat down across from her with his coffee and stayed longer than he usually did. He ended up telling her about a training exercise from his Navy days, not the details, just the structure of it, how his unit had learned to communicate across distances without speaking, without radios, using only hand positions readable at 30 feet. He demonstrated a few signals on the tabletop, fingers moving in short, deliberate sequences. She asked him what each one meant. He told her. She practiced 2 of them back at him, and he nodded once, which was as close to impressed as she had ever seen him get. She had thought it was just a story. She had thought he was just for once letting something out. She had not understood until much later that Terrence Brooks never told a story without a reason. What developed between them did so slowly and without announcement. Shared coffee during shift changes. The occasional conversation that ran longer than either of them had intended. Maya started appearing in the first-floor waiting area on days when Terrence worked a long shift and the after-school program ran late. A composed, watchful 9-year-old who did her homework in the corner chair and accepted Elena's offers of juice and crackers with a gravity that made Elena want to smile every time. Terrence noticed that Elena was the only person on staff who talked to Maya like she was a person rather than a child-shaped object to be managed. He didn't say anything about it. He noticed. Neither of them said anything about any of it. There were lines that hadn't been crossed yet, and both of them seemed to understand without discussion that crossing them would change things in ways that couldn't be undone. Victor Dane came in on a Tuesday night, 40 minutes before midnight. He had a gunshot wound to the upper right arm, through and through, no arterial involvement. The paramedics who brought him in had his ID and a brief from the 2 patrol officers who'd been first on scene. Victor Dane, 34, no prior record, caught in the crossfire of a dispute outside a parking garage on the south side. Wrong place, wrong time, civilian victim. The officers stepped out to run his name through the system. Terrence was in the adjacent bay replacing a power module on a cardiac monitor when the charge nurse asked him to check the outlet configuration in Bay 3. He walked in, assessed the room, and was 3 steps toward the electrical panel when he registered Victor Dane in his peripheral vision. He didn't stop walking. He reached the panel, pulled the cover, and began checking the connections. He had spent 3 seconds looking at the man in the bed, but 3 seconds had been sufficient. The calluses on Victor's knuckles were wrong for a civilian. They were distributed in a pattern that came from specific training, not general physical labor. There was a tattoo on his left forearm, partially covered by the edge of the bandage. What was visible suggested a design that had been deliberately obscured, the kind of modification someone made when they didn't want the original ink identified. And Victor was tracking the positions of the 2 ceiling-mounted cameras with the systematic patience of a man running a mental map of his environment. He was not watching the medical staff, he was watching the room. Terrence finished the panel check, made a note on his tablet, and stepped out into the hallway. He positioned himself where he had a line of sight to the bay entrance and waited to see what Victor was waiting for. He didn't have to wait long. One of the patrol officers still in the corridor took a call and said something to his partner. The words were low, but the hallway acoustics were unforgiving. The phone recovered at the scene had been flagged, federal hold. They needed to get it transferred out of evidence lockup tonight. Victor heard it. Terrence watched Victor hear it. What happened next took less than 30 seconds. Victor pulled the dressing from his arm, tore a strip of metal housing from the instrument tray with a speed that suggested he'd located it the moment he was brought into the room, and had Elena Foster pressed against the wall with the edge of the metal at her throat before the physician beside her finished turning around. What happened after that was already in the camera's memory. Victor was restrained, logged, and moved to a secure observation room under police hold within 20 minutes of the incident. The department settled back into its rhythm with the practiced efficiency of people who had processed worse. Terrence was filing an incident report at a workstation near the nurse's station when something made him go back into Bay 3 before he left. Not a sound, not a movement, just the residue of a habit that had kept him alive in rooms where missing a detail meant someone died. There were marks on the inner bed rail near the head, not scratches. 3 deliberate strokes made with something dark, dried blood from the wound site applied with a fingertip in the minute before the officers returned. Terrence stood very still and looked at the marks for a long time. He had seen that configuration before. Not in a hospital. In a briefing document 9 years ago in a room with no windows. It was a contact signal, a marker used by a specific trafficking network to communicate across controlled environments when electronic communication wasn't possible. Victor Dane hadn't acted out of panic. He'd been placed here. Terrence went directly to Dr. Warren Bell's office. Bell was still in the building, working late in the way that administrators worked late. Lights on door open the performance of diligence. Terrence told him what he'd found. He recommended locking down the external access points, verifying the identity of everyone currently on the night roster, and placing a call to the federal liaison at the precinct. Not because he was certain, because the cost of being wrong in one direction was a wasted phone call, and the cost of being wrong in the other direction was something he didn't want to calculate out loud. Bell heard him out. Then Bell told him that the hospital was currently navigating a difficult week in terms of press exposure. There had been a medication incident, the details of which were still being managed, and that introducing a security lockdown on the basis of marks on a bed rail would draw exactly the kind of attention the institution could not absorb right now. He said Terrence had shown poor judgment in using physical force on a patient earlier in the evening, regardless of the circumstances, and that pending the internal review, his access to the department was suspended effective immediately. He said it without anger. That was the thing that stayed with Terrence afterward. Bell said all of it without anger, the way someone delivers a decision they made before the conversation started. Terrence walked out of the office and down the corridor and through the side door into the parking structure. He stood in the cold for 10 minutes. He thought about calling the after-school coordinator and asking her to take Maya to his mother's house tonight, no explanation needed. He had a go-bag at home. He knew how to be somewhere else by morning. He thought about Elena still inside. He thought about the 312 patients currently admitted to St. Catherine's Medical Center, most of whom were asleep, and none of whom had any reason to know that a man who had just marked a wall with blood was connected to people who were in all likelihood already on their way. Terrence went back inside. The video was online before midnight. Someone in the department had pulled the security footage, 37 seconds Bay 3, the moment Victor Dane came off the bed, and posted it without watermark or context. By 2 in the morning, it had been shared widely enough that the hospital's communications office was fielding calls. By 6, it had been picked up by 3 local news stations and 1 national outlet, each of which described the incident in slightly different terms, but all of which focused on the same image: a maintenance worker in gray coveralls putting a grown man on the floor with the efficiency of someone who had done it before. The comments split cleanly. Half called Terrence a hero, the other half asked who he really was. Detective Nolan Pierce was asking the same question with more resources. Pierce had been assigned to the shooting investigation that brought Victor Dane into St. Catherine's in the first place, a parking garage altercation on the south side that had left 2 other men hospitalized and 1 crime scene full of evidence that did not match the witness accounts. He had come to the hospital that morning to follow up, and had instead spent an hour watching the video on his phone and running Terrence Brooks through every database available to him. What he found was a clean surface and a sealed interior. Terrence had a valid driver's license, a rental history, a tax record, a daughter enrolled in public school, nothing unusual. But the 9-year gap from age 22 to 31 was closed off behind a military classification code that Pierce did not have clearance to open. 9 years of a man's life locked behind a designation that Pierce had only seen twice before, and both of those cases had involved people who did things for the government that the government preferred not to discuss. He brought Terrence in for questioning at 7:15 in the morning. The interrogation room was deliberately uncomfortable, low-temperature, flat light, the particular silence of a space designed to make people feel it. Terrence sat with his hands resting on the table and said very little. He confirmed his name, his employer, his presence in Bay 3. He described what Victor had done and what he had done in response. He did not explain the speed or the precision because Pierce did not ask directly, and Terrence had spent years understanding the difference between a question being asked and a question being implied. Pierce implied a great deal. He said that men with Terrence's apparent skill set did not usually end up maintaining electrical panels in emergency departments. He said the sealed record created a problem, not a legal one, not yet, but a practical one in terms of establishing context. He said he was trying to understand the full picture. Terrence said he understood and said nothing else that Pierce could use. He was still in the building when the situation at St. Catherine's moved to the next phase. Victor Dane had regained full alertness by 9 that morning. The attending physician noted his vitals were stable and his responses were oriented. What the attending physician did not note, because there was no reason to look for it, was the text message Victor had received and deleted in the 40 seconds between a nurse leaving his room and a different nurse entering, sent to a secondary device that had been taped under the bed frame by a hospital supply contractor who had made a delivery 3 days prior and had no other connection to the case on record. The message contained 4 words and a room number. Victor told the officer stationed outside his door that he needed to speak to a detective immediately. He had information about the shooting, he said. He had been afraid to come forward earlier, but he wanted to cooperate. When a junior detective came to take his statement, Victor described the events in Bay 3 with careful inversion. He said he had been frightened and confused from the blood loss. He said the maintenance worker had come at him without warning, that Victor had grabbed the instrument fragment in self-defense. He said he had witnesses and that he was prepared to pursue the matter. He delivered it without visible effort. He had been doing this for a long time. Dr. Warren Bell received a copy of the statement within the hour and forwarded it along with the incident report he had written the previous evening to the hospital's legal counsel. The incident report characterized Terrence's intervention as an unauthorized use of force by a non-security employee against a patient in his care. It did not mention the marks on the bed rail. It did not mention Terrence's recommendation to lock down the department. Bell had written it with the steady hand of a man protecting an institution he had spent 20 years building his career inside, who had decided at some point that the institution and his position within it were the same thing. Elena found out about Victor's statement when she was called into the nursing director's office at 10:15. She told them exactly what had happened. She described the instrument fragment, the position the way Terrence had spoken to Victor before Victor moved. She said she would put it in writing, sign it, and repeat it in front of anyone who needed to hear it. The nursing director told her that a parallel investigation was underway, that her account was noted, and that she should avoid any further contact with Terrence Brooks or the case until the review was complete. The director said it gently, the way people say things gently when they mean them as a warning. She said the word license once without emphasis and didn't need to say it again. Elena walked out of the office and stood in the hallway for a moment. Then she went back to work because there were patients who needed her and because stopping was not something she knew how to do. Pierce released Terrence at 11:40 for lack of grounds to hold him. Terrence walked back into St. Catherine's through the maintenance entrance, the one that required a key card that had not yet been deactivated. Bell's suspension had gone to HR, but the system update ran on a 24-hour cycle. He had 23 hours of access remaining, and he intended to use them. He found the problem within 4 minutes of entering the building. The camera network ran on a segmented system, 6 zones each with its own recording loop and a separate backup feed. Someone had accessed the administrative console and disabled zones 2, 4, and 5 in a sequence that was not random. The disabled zones covered the loading dock entrance, the service corridor connecting the east and west wings, and the stairwell cluster at the building's center. They had been taken down at staggered intervals over a 40-minute window, not simultaneously, which was why the automated monitoring system had logged them as individual malfunctions rather than a coordinated shutdown. The fire exit on the second floor had been locked from the central access panel. So had the stairwell door on the third. Both logged as routine security holds. Terrence stood in the maintenance corridor looking at his tablet and understood the shape of what was happening. He took the service stairs to the basement and checked the loading dock access log. 4 personnel badges had been swiped in at 7:40 that morning, registered as a medical supply delivery from a vendor whose contract number existed in the hospital system because someone had entered it there. The badges showed names. The names, when Terrence cross-referenced them against the current staff roster, matched 4 employees who were scheduled off today. The building had 4 people inside it who were not supposed to be here, who had come in through the least monitored entrance, and who had arrived while he was sitting in a police interrogation room. He was moving toward the east stairwell when he heard Elena's voice. Not distressed, controlled, deliberate, the tone of someone choosing each word with care. She was in the corridor ahead of him, speaking to a man in a medical transport uniform who was standing between her and the stairwell door. The man was not a transport worker. The way he stood was wrong, weight too evenly distributed, hands at the wrong resting position, the specific stillness of someone trained to remain calm in situations that would destabilize an ordinary person. Terrence stepped back into a supply alcove and assessed. The man said something low that Terrence couldn't fully catch. Elena said she would bring him to the recovery unit herself. She said it clearly, without hesitation, in the voice of a person cooperating fully. She was lying. Terrence had heard her voice in enough situations to know its textures, and the texture of full cooperation was not what he was hearing. She was stalling. She turned away from the man and led him toward the stairwell, not the direct route to the 4th floor recovery unit, but the longer path through the 2nd floor connector corridor, past 3 occupied patient bays and the nurse's station, and the supply room that was always backed up with equipment carts that made the hallway slow to navigate. The route that would take 3 times as long as the alternative and put them in proximity to the most populated section of the floor. It wasn't a plan. There was no time for a plan. It was the instinct of a woman who had spent 6 years learning which rooms in a hospital were full of people and which were not, and who had chosen in the moment she had to walk toward the people. Terrence moved. He came around the stairwell from the opposite side and used the cart access elevator to reach the 4th floor ahead of them. He located the 3 remaining members of the Group 2 in the South Recovery Corridor, 1 posted near the room where the federal witness was currently sedated post-surgery, and disabled them in sequence. The first with the elevator itself, timed and precise, the second with the lighting grid for that section of corridor triggering a momentary blackout that lasted long enough. The third in direct contact fast and without noise in the supply anteroom adjacent to the witness's room. He got the witness's door locked from inside and told the attending nurse to keep it that way and not open it for anyone who could not slide a hospital ID badge under the door and match the name he gave her. Then he called down to the security desk and gave the guard on duty a name and a room number and told him to stand there and not let anyone through for any reason. The guard was 23 years old and had been on the job for 4 months. He said okay in the voice of someone who understood that the time for asking questions had passed. Terrence was in the 3rd floor corridor when Elena came through the stairwell door with the man in the transport uniform 2 steps behind her. She saw Terrence. She did not change her expression. The man registered Terrence a half-second later and reached for something at his waist. It didn't go well for him. Elena pressed herself against the wall and looked at Terrence, really looked at him, the way she hadn't quite allowed herself to since the night before. He was moving through the hospital like he knew exactly where every threat was and exactly how much time he had, like the building was a problem he had already solved and was now simply executing. Cold and precise and several steps ahead of everything around him. She said his name. He glanced at her while securing the man's wrists with a cable tie from his tool belt. "You bought time," he said. "That was the right call." "Who are you?" she said. He didn't stop what he was doing. "I used to bring people home," he said. "I'll explain the rest later." Detective Pierce arrived at St. Catherine's at 11 minutes past noon, responding to a security alarm that had been triggered from a maintenance access point in the East Wing. He came in expecting a malfunction or a break-in. He found a hospital with its camera system partially restored, one man zip-tied to a stairwell railing, and Terrence Brooks walking toward him with a tablet and the expression of a man with more information than time. Pierce's first instinct was professional reflex. This was still an open investigation, and the subject of that investigation was standing in front of him in the middle of what appeared to be an active incident. He started to say so. Then he saw what was happening in the corridor behind Terrence. A man in a medical transport uniform, not the one tied to the railing, a different one from the far end of the hall, had a patient's IV stand raised and was moving in their direction, and Terrence, without turning around, shifted his footing and said, "Your left." Pierce drew, pivoted left, and the man stopped. He thought about it afterward, reconstructed it carefully, the way good investigators reconstructed things that didn't fit their existing framework. There was no angle from which Terrence could have seen the man coming, no reflection, no sound that Pierce had registered, nothing. He had known because he had been tracking the building's moving parts continuously, accounting for positions and intervals, and the math had told him something was coming from the left. That was not what maintenance technicians did. Pierce looked at Terrence for a long moment, then he lowered his weapon to a resting position and said, "Tell me what you need." They established a working plan in 7 minutes in the stairwell. Pierce would coordinate the external response, get federal contacts on the phone, get a tactical unit moving toward the building, create a perimeter that looked passive from the outside. Terrence would manage the interior, locate the fourth member of the group who had not yet been accounted for, and keep the witness secure until backup arrived. It held for 11 minutes. Bell had been in his office on the 3rd floor since mid-morning, tracking the incident through the hospital's internal communication system with the access privileges that came with his position. When he heard Pierce relay the witness's room number to his federal contact through the security channel, a channel Bell had administrative access to and had never imagined would carry anything like this, he made a decision. He did not call the criminals. He would not have described what he did as helping them. He called the hospital's legal office and told them that a federal operation was being conducted on hospital premises without proper institutional notification, that there were liability implications, and that he needed guidance immediately. He gave the room number so the legal team could assess the scope of the situation. The call lasted 4 minutes. The legal office's phone line ran through the hospital's external network, which had been compromised by the entry team at 7:40 that morning. Everything came down at once. Pierce took a round in the left shoulder from the 4th team member who had been positioned in the overhead mechanical space above the 2nd floor corridor. Pierce went down against the wall, still conscious, weapon in hand. Elena, who had been staying 3 steps behind Terrence per instruction, was grabbed from a side corridor by the man who had been coordinating from outside the building the entire time, the one Terrence had not been able to locate because he had never come in. The federal witness's room was next. The attending nurse held the door exactly as instructed, would not open it, would not respond. So the 2 men sent to retrieve the witness did not ask. They cut the power to the electronic lock from the junction panel in the adjacent supply room, a bypass that took 40 seconds and required knowing exactly which breaker controlled which door. The lock released. The nurse inside had no way to stop what happened next. Terrence came around the corner and found Pierce on the floor and Elena gone, and understood immediately that the operational picture had collapsed. He found out about Maya 90 seconds later. The after-school program coordinator had texted him at 12:04 she'd brought Maya to the hospital because Maya had a dental appointment that afternoon and the coordinator's car was in the shop. Was it okay if she waited at the front desk? The message had come in while Terrence was in the stairwell with Pierce, phone on silent. Maya had been at the front desk at 12:04. The man who had never come inside walked up to Terrence in the east corridor at 12:22 and told him without preamble that his daughter was with them and that the exchange terms were simple: the phone, the witness, and a clear exit in exchange for the two people currently on the roof waiting for a helicopter that was 12 minutes out. Then he told Terrence something else. He said he had been part of the network that sold the position of Terrence's unit during the operation 7 years ago. He said it without drama, as a statement of fact intended to produce a specific effect. He said Marcus Webb's name. It produced the effect. Terrence felt something come loose in his chest that he had kept bolted down for 7 years. His next breath was slower than it should have been. His hands wanted to do something that would end the conversation permanently, and the part of his brain that was still running calculations knew exactly how to accomplish that and was already mapping the geometry. He was still standing in the corridor, hands at his sides, when Pierce's voice came over the dropped radio on the floor nearby. Pierce was still conscious. He was telling Terrence what he could see from where he was sitting: the access point, the elevator, the position of the stairwell door. He was still on the job. Terrence looked at the radio. He picked it up. He told Pierce to stay on the line. Then he began to move. Terrence found the device at 12:31. He had gone to the basement because the man's confidence bothered him. Not the confidence itself, but the specific quality of it. The ease of someone who had already removed the variables he couldn't control. Men who took hostages to a rooftop and called for extraction did not feel that secure unless they had already eliminated the possibility of intervention from below, which meant they had done something to the building that Terrence hadn't found yet. He went through the basement mechanical room in under 4 minutes and located it behind the main oxygen distribution panel, a pressure device, compact and professionally assembled, connected to the primary feed valve with a bypass rigged to override the system's automatic shutoffs. It wasn't designed to destroy the building. It was designed to do something more specific. When the valve blew out, it would send an overpressure surge through the distribution network into the ICU supply lines on floors 3 and 4, where the oxygen concentration in the wall systems was high enough to turn a minor ignition into something that moved faster than the suppression system could respond. The patients in the ICU could not evacuate themselves. Most of them could not move at all. Terrence stood in front of the panel and understood the geometry of the next 12 minutes with absolute clarity. He could stay in the basement, isolate the compromised valve, and walk Pierce through the bypass procedure over the radio. If it worked, the ICU would be safe. He would not be on the roof. He could go to the roof. If he moved now, he had a chance to reach Maya and Elena before the helicopter did. The device would activate on its timer, regardless of what happened above ground. There was not enough time for both. There was not a version of the next 12 minutes in which one person accomplished everything that needed to be accomplished. He had known this about himself for a long time, the thing that had broken him after Marcus, the belief that had calcified over years of solo operations into something that felt like competence but was actually a kind of arrogance, the belief that if he was good enough and fast enough and precise enough, he would not need to share the weight, that sharing the weight was a failure of preparation. Marcus had died in his arms partly because of that belief. Because Terrence had been running a one-man perimeter instead of calling for help that might have come. He keyed the radio. Pierce. Pierce's voice came back thin but steady. Still here. I need you to do something. I'm going to walk you through it step by step. You need to be able to move your right hand and read what I'm telling you. A pause. I can do that. Terrence told him about the device. He described the bypass panel, the valve configuration, the 3 isolation points that needed to be shut in a specific sequence to cut the compromised line without triggering the pressure surge. He had maintained that system for 3 years. He knew the location of every access point, every manual override, every idiosyncrasy in the aging hardware that the maintenance logs had been flagging for replacement since the year before he was hired. He gave Pierce each step with the clarity of someone who had learned finally and at cost that clear instructions were not a weakness. Then he called the young security guard still posted in the ICU corridor. "I need you to move everyone who can be moved out of that hallway right now. You don't need a reason. You're the authority on that floor. Use it." A beat of silence. Then, "Yes, sir." Terrence clipped the radio to his belt and went to the elevator shaft. The elevator had been shut down from the central access panel, one of the first things the group had done when they took control of the building's systems. The shaft itself was accessible through the maintenance hatch on the basement level, a feature Terrence had used twice before for legitimate repairs and had never mentioned to anyone because it was the kind of access point that made security officers nervous. He went up the shaft hand over hand through 4 floors of cable and counterweight and the particular darkness of spaces not meant to be traveled, and came out through the roof access door at 12:38. The rooftop was a wide, flat expanse of utility infrastructure, HVAC units, antenna mounts, the elevator housing the water tank at the north end. The helipad occupied the south quarter, marked with faded paint and equipped with a lighting array that had been installed 3 years ago and tested once. The helicopter was visible in the distance, coming in from the east. The man stood at the helipad's edge with Elena beside him, and Maya, 6 feet away, held by a second man who had one hand on her shoulder and was watching the sky. Maya was not crying. She was standing very still in the way that children stand still when they have assessed the situation and determined that stillness is the correct response, and Terrence felt something move through him when he saw it, recognition and grief, and something close to pride all at once. The man turned when Terrence came through the roof access door. He did not look surprised. "I thought you'd be in the basement," he said. "I delegated," Terrence said. The man studied him for a moment, recalculating something. Then he said, "Marcus Webb bled out because you couldn't hold a perimeter and call for backup at the same time. That's not a tragedy, that's a skills assessment." He said it the way someone says something they have prepared in advance, testing for a specific crack in a specific wall. Terrence kept walking toward him slowly, hands visible. "Keep talking," he said. "You've got maybe 8 minutes before this becomes someone else's problem." "The helicopter lands in 4. "Then you've got 4. He was not arguing. He was not performing calm. He was doing what he had learned to do in rooms where the temperature mattered, maintaining a surface that gave the other person nothing to read, while he counted the distance between himself and Maya himself and Elena himself and the man whose weight distribution he had been reading since the moment he came through the door. He was also moving his right hand in a pattern against his thigh, small and deliberate, the same sequence of finger positions he had shown Elena one afternoon in the cafeteria when he was telling her about training exercises. He moved through the sequence once, then again. He watched her from the corner of his eye. She was listening. The man began to say something about the nature of men who allowed sentiment to compromise their operational effectiveness. He had a point he was building toward. Terrence could hear the structure of it, the rhythm of someone who had rehearsed an argument. He let him build it. He watched Elena shift her weight incrementally to her left, redistributing her center of gravity, her right hand dropping slightly from where the man held her wrist. The helicopter was 2 minutes out. Terrence could hear it now, low and constant, approaching from the east. He moved his fingers through the final position in the sequence. Elena drove her left elbow back and down into the man's solar plexus, rotated her wrist against his thumb joint, the weakest point of any grip, a fact she knew from 6 years of managing combative patients, and pulled forward. He bent at the waist. Terrence crossed the distance in 4 steps. What followed was not clean. The man was trained, genuinely trained, with the kind of muscle memory that didn't disappear under stress, and he recovered faster than most people would have. He caught Terrence with a strike to the ribs that connected with the wound from the basement, and for a moment the edges of Terrence's vision went bright and then dark. He felt the rooftop surface under his knee. He heard Maya say something behind him, short and urgent. He got back up. He was slower than he had been at 30. He was slower than he had been at 35. But he had learned things at 38 that 25-year-old Terrence could not have used, and one of them was that a fight was not a performance. You did not have to be fast. You had to last 1 second longer than the other person. The man made a mistake at the 40-second mark, committed his weight forward when he thought Terrence was finished, and Terrence used it. He took him to the ground, controlled the right arm, and put enough pressure on the shoulder joint to communicate that the next movement would end the conversation in a way that wouldn't be reversible. The man went still. Terrence was breathing hard. The helicopter was overhead now, the downdraft pressing against everything on the roof, the noise of it filling the air completely. He looked at the man's face, 6 inches from the rooftop surface. He thought about Marcus. He thought about the specific wait of 11 minutes in a room where someone was bleeding out, the way time moved differently in those situations, the way he had replayed every decision in that room for 7 years. He thought about a man who had sold their position, who had made a phone call or sent a message or accepted a payment and had known when he did it what the cost would be to the people on the other end. His grip tightened. Then Maya said, "Dad!" Not scared, not asking him to stop, just saying his name the way she said it when she wanted him to know she was there. He loosened his grip. He pinned the man's wrist with his knee, stripped the firearm from the holster at his side, and stood up. The second man, the one who had been holding Maya, had his hands raised. The helicopter was already pulling back the pilot, having assessed the situation on the roof and determined that this extraction was not going to proceed as planned. Terrence walked to Maya and put his hand on the back of her head, and she pressed her face against his chest and didn't say anything. He held her there for a moment, then he looked at Elena. She was standing with her back against the rooftop housing, hair pushed sideways by the fading downdraft, watching him. He said, "You remembered." She said, "I remember most things." Pierce isolated the valve at 12:42:40 seconds before the device's timer reached 0. He did it one-handed, following the sequence Terrence had given him, step by step, using the radio as a reference, because the pain in his shoulder made it difficult to hold both the instructions and the procedure in his head at the same time. He said afterward that he had simply decided not to think about anything except the next step, which was he acknowledged essentially what Terrence had been doing all morning. The tactical unit arrived at 12:51. Federal agents followed at 1:17. By 3 in the afternoon, St. Catherine's Medical Center had been cleared, documented, and reopened to incoming emergency patients with a temporary security framework that bore no resemblance to the one that had been on paper that morning. The phone taken from Victor Dane's evidence bag, the phone Victor had been trying to reach before he grabbed the instrument fragment in Bay 3, was decrypted by federal analysts and found to contain 4 years of financial records, 2 years of operational communications, a list of 14 officials across 3 states who had received payments, and a file that Terrence had not known existed. An internal communication from 7 years ago that named the government contractor who had sold his unit's operational position before the mission. The contractor had retired 18 months after the event. He was arrested at his home that evening. Marcus Webb had not died because Terrence failed. He had died because someone had made a choice for money in an office somewhere without standing anywhere near the consequences of that choice. Terrence read the summary in a hospital corridor at 4:15 in the afternoon, sitting on a bench outside the room where a nurse was redressing the wound in his side, and he sat with it for a long time without moving. It did not fix anything. It did not return 11 minutes or change the weight of what 7 years of carrying the wrong explanation had done. But it was the truth, and the truth had a different mass than guilt, and he had forgotten what it felt like to hold something that weighed what it actually weighed. Warren Bell was arrested at 5:40 that afternoon on charges related to obstruction of a federal investigation and falsification of an institutional incident report. His legal counsel advised him to cooperate fully, which he did with the thoroughness of a man who had always been better at managing paperwork than making decisions. Victor Dane accepted a cooperation agreement and provided testimony sufficient to support 12 separate indictments. Nolan Pierce's shoulder required surgery. He was out of the building by 6 and told Terrence as he was being taken to pre-op that the incident report he was going to file would not contain the phrase unauthorized use of force in any section. Terrence said he appreciated it. Pierce said he was just being accurate. Elena's name was cleared without a formal process being necessary. The sequence of events made any alternative characterization indefensible. The interim department chief installed the day after Bell's arrest asked her to take on the role of patient safety and emergency response coordinator on a permanent basis. She said she would, on the condition that the security assessment be conducted by people who had actually been in the building during a crisis rather than people who had been watching one from an office. The interim chief agreed without hesitation. He seemed relieved someone had made the decision for him. A week after the incident, Terrence came to the cafeteria at the end of Elena's shift and sat down across from her at the corner table, the one with the clear sight line to the door, which she had started choosing without consciously deciding to. He told her about Marcus, not a summary, the actual story, in the order it had happened, including the 11 minutes and the weight of them and the explanation he had carried for 7 years that had turned out to be wrong. He told her about the box in the closet, and what was in it, and why he had put it there. He said he wasn't telling her because he needed her to understand him. He said he was telling her because he had kept it alone for long enough, and she was the person he wanted to stop keeping it from. Elena listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she had trusted him before she knew anything about his past. Not because of what he could do, but because of what he stopped doing, because when it was over, every time he stopped. He didn't keep going. He put the man on the floor and asked if she was hurt. He knocked the man off the roof and held his daughter. She said that in her experience, the capacity to stop was rarer than the capacity to act, and it was the thing she had never been able to explain about why she had never been afraid of him, not even in the moments that should have been frightening. Terrence looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I'll work on deserving that." Elena said, "You already started." Several months later, the lockbox was no longer in the closet. It sat on the living room shelf next to a photograph Maya had taken at the library on her own phone, a slightly crooked shot of Terrence reading in the chair by the window, not aware he was being photographed, which was the reason she liked it. The box was not displayed or explained. It was simply there, part of the room the way all the other things in the room were part of it. In the fall, there was a memorial service for the unit. A small ceremony held at a veterans facility across the city, attended by people who had served alongside men who had not come home. Terrence had not attended the previous 6. He attended this one. Elena stood on his left, Maya stood on his right, her hand in his, looking at the names on the display with the focused attention she brought to things she understood were serious. After a few minutes, she looked up at him and asked whether he was still a Navy SEAL. Terrence looked at Elena. She was already watching him, and there was something in her expression that was not a question. It was an answer she had already arrived at, waiting for him to arrive at it too. He looked back down at Maya. "No," he said. "Now I'm just someone who comes home." Maya considered this with the gravity of someone evaluating a statement against all available evidence. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied, and looked back at the names on the display. The 3 of them stood there together until the ceremony was finished. Then they walked out into the afternoon, and Terrence held the door, and they left. There's something this story keeps coming back to. Not the fighting, not the tactics, not the reveal. It keeps coming back to a man standing in a parking lot in the cold, deciding whether to leave or go back inside. He had every reason to leave. He had a daughter to protect, a past he'd spent years burying, and absolutely no obligation to walk back through those doors. Nobody would have blamed him. Nobody even knew enough about him to blame him. He went back inside anyway. That's the thing about people who carry real weight quietly. They don't make announcements about it. They don't wait for recognition. They just keep showing up, keep choosing the harder thing, keep walking back through the door when it would be so much easier not to. Terrence wasn't the strongest person in that building because of what he could do with his hands. He was the strongest person in that building because when everything was falling apart around him, he still stopped to think about the people who couldn't protect themselves. That kind of strength doesn't wear a uniform. It doesn't come with a title. Most of the time, you wouldn't even know it was standing next to you. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of someone you know or something you believe, or just made you feel like the right people don't always get seen the way they deserve to be seen, then you're exactly who this channel is for. Subscribe and stay with us. Every story we tell is about people like Terrence. The ones you almost missed.